Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to take a nice, slow walk through a very specific kind of historical delusion. So, go ahead, dim the lights, get under the covers, find that cool side of the pillow, and just let your mind drift. We spend a lot of time on this channel talking about the weird, dark, and often deeply embarrassing lives of European royalty. The endless inbreeding, the tragically weak chins, the absolute inability of these people to make a single good life decision. But tonight, we're looking at a slightly different kind of royal dysfunction. Tonight, we're looking at the kings, queens, and absolute elites who had all the drama, all the unfathomable wealth, and all the bizarre quirks you could ever ask for. But they lacked one very important thing: a pulse, because they never actually existed. Welcome to the medieval figures who were completely made up, but everyone absolutely believed were real. Let's just drift back to the 12th century. The year is 1165. Europe is a mess, as usual. The Crusades are going terribly. Everyone is miserable, tired, and probably dealing with mild scurvy. And then, out of nowhere, a letter arrives. It's addressed to the Byzantine Emperor, but copies quickly circulate to the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and basically anyone who can read. Which, to be fair, wasn't a huge list at the time. The letter is from a man named Prester John. Prester just meant presbyter, or priest, Priest John. But he wasn't just a priest. According to his very humble, totally unpretentious letter, he was the king of the three Indies. He was a devout Christian, and he ruled over a kingdom of unimaginable wealth and peace somewhere out in the east. Now, if you got an email today from a foreign prince claiming he had a massive fortune and wanted to help you out, you'd send it to spam. But medieval Europe didn't have spam filters. They had desperation. They read this letter and thought, finally, some good news. Prester John's letter was basically a medieval flex. He described his kingdom in agonizing, sleep-inducing detail. He wrote that his territory extended all the way to the Tower of Babel. He claimed to rule over 70 lesser kings, which, if you think about it, sounds like an absolute middle management nightmare. Just endless meetings that could have been scrolls. But it gets weirder. He claimed his land was completely free of crime, poverty, and vice. No thieves, no liars, and, of course, no frogs. He specifically mentioned there were no noisy frogs in his rivers, because when you're making up a utopia, you definitely need to ban the amphibians. He also went on at length about his local fauna. He had elephants, camels, and lions. Sure, but he also claimed his kingdom was home to horned men, one-eyed men, men with hooves instead of feet, and the classic cynocephaly, which were men with the heads of dogs. Just your standard, everyday royal subjects. Imagine being a French peasant, eating your boiled, unseasoned turnip, and hearing about a king who employs dogmen in his army. Of course, you'd believe it. It's a lot more interesting than the turnip. John also claimed to have a giant mirror, elevated on a multi-tiered tower. He used this mirror to look out over his entire empire and spy on his subjects to make sure no one was plotting against him. So, essentially, a magical medieval CCTV system, because even completely fictional kings have massive trust issues. The Europeans absolutely ate this up. Pope Alexander III actually wrote a letter back to Prester John in 1177 and gave it to his personal physician, a guy named Philip. He told Philip to travel east until he found this magical king and deliver the letter. Philip packed his bags, headed east, and was quite literally never heard from again. Of course, he wasn't. He was looking for a mirage, but Europe didn't give up. For centuries, whenever explorers went east, they looked for Prester John. When Marco Polo went to Asia, he claimed he found the region where Prester John used to rule, but oh, sadly, the empire had fallen. Very convenient, Marcao. When the Portuguese started exploring the coast of Africa, they just moved the goalposts. They decided Prester John wasn't in India after all. He was in Ethiopia, because admitting you were historically catfished by a forged piece of parchment just wasn't an option for these people, so they doubled down. Let's float over to another historical disaster, or rather, a papal one. If Prester John was the ultimate fake king, Pope Joan was the ultimate fake elite. The story goes that in the 9th century, between the reigns of Pope Leo IV and Pope Benedict III, there was a Pope John VIII. But Joan was not a John. Joan was a Joan. According to the legend, Joan was an Englishwoman born in the city of Mainz. She was incredibly brilliant, but being a woman in the Middle Ages, she wasn't allowed to do much with that brilliance. So, she did what any rational, highly ambitious person would do. She put on men's clothes, changed her name to John Anglicus, and traveled to Athens to study science and philosophy, which is quite a feat, considering Athens in the 9th century was basically a ruined, depopulated ghost town. But let's not let geography get in the way of a good rumor. Joan, disguised as John, eventually makes her way to Rome. She gets a job as a notary, then a cardinal. And because she is so incredibly smart and pious, when the old pope dies, everyone unanimously elects her as the new pope. Now, you would think that reaching the absolute highest office in the Western world would be the time to lay low, to keep your head down, and maybe avoid complicated romantic but no. Joan apparently took a lover. And not just took a lover, but got pregnant. While being the pope, she managed to hide the pregnancy, somehow, beneath her heavy papal robes. But unfortunately for Joan, nature runs on its own schedule. During a solemn religious procession, walking from St. Peter's Basilica to the right in a narrow, crowded street, the Pope suddenly went into labor, which is, you have to admit, pretty bad timing. The crowds are horrified. The cardinals are having collective aneurysms. According to the legend, she gave birth right there on the cobblestones. The story usually ends with her either dying in childbirth, right there in the street, or being dragged out of the city and stoned to death by the angry mob, because medieval mobs rarely handled surprises well. Now, this story is entirely fictional. There is literally no gap in the historical record for her to fit into. Leo IV died, and Benedict III took over just a few weeks later. We have coins from the period. We have documents. Joan did not exist, but the sheer, absolute panic this fictional story caused in the medieval church is hilarious. People believed it. They believed it so hard that they supposedly altered the route of that specific papal procession to avoid the street where she allegedly gave birth. They called it the Cursed Street. And then there was the chair. Desidia stercoraria. Because the church was apparently so traumatized by the idea of accidentally electing a woman again, they supposedly instituted a new rule. Whenever a new pope was elected, he had to sit on a special marble chair, a chair that had a hole cut out of the seat. A junior cleric would then have to reach up from underneath, or at least physically look, to confirm that the new pope had the appropriate male anatomy. Once confirmed, the cleric would announce to the crowd, "Duos habet, iti bene pendentes," which roughly translates to, "He has to, and they hang well." Just imagine the scene. A room full of grumpy, powerful cardinals, all waiting in awkward silence while someone peers under a marble chair. Because why not double down on the weirdness? Of course, the chair-checking ceremony is also mostly a myth. The chairs did exist. They were actually ancient Roman birthing chairs, or betelaicedes that were just repurposed as thrones, but there's no real evidence they were used for papal anatomy checks. Still, the fact that people gossiped about it for centuries tells you everything you need to know about the medieval mindset. They loved the drama. They crabbed Italiano. Moving on from the fake popes, let's slowly drift toward the foggy bogs of England to visit a royal who has caused more historical headaches than anyone else, King Arthur. Now, I know what you're thinking, but sleepless historian, King Arthur is based on a real person. Sure? Maybe? Possibly. Some Romano-British warlord who fought the Saxons in the 5th century. But the King Arthur we know, the guy with his shiny plate armor, the massive stone castles, the round table, and the overly dramatic knights who spent all their time sulking over unrequited love. That guy is completely, utterly fabricated. Arthur as we know him was essentially fan fiction, invented by a 12th century cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth. Geoffrey wrote a book called The History of the Kings of Britain, and he basically just made most of it up. He took a few vague Welsh myths, threw in some magic, added a wizard named Merlin, and created a medieval bestseller. And just like with Prester John, the elites of Europe ate it up. They desperately wanted Arthur to be real. English kings wanted to trace their lineage back to him to prove how legitimate they were. This obsession reached a peak in the year 1191 at Glastonbury Abbey. Glastonbury was a very old, very prestigious monastery. But they had a problem. They had just suffered a massive fire, and they were broke. They needed money to rebuild, and in the Middle Ages, the best way to get money was to have some really good relics to attract pilgrims. So, very conveniently, the monks of Glastonbury just happened to be digging in their graveyard one day, and what do you know? They found a massive oak trunk buried deep in the ground, and inside that trunk were two skeletons. One was a huge man, supposedly with terrible head wounds. The other was a woman, and according to the monks, she still had a scrap of blonde hair attached to her skull. But wait, there's more. Just in case anyone was confused about who these random giant bones belonged to, the monks also claimed to have found a lead cross buried right on top of the log, and inscribed on that cross, in perfectly legible Latin, was a message that basically said, "Here lies buried the famous King Arthur, in the Isle of Avalon, with his second wife Guinevere," a very convenient, perfectly labeled tourist trap for some financially struggling monks. Even in the 12th century, you've got to hustle. The monks put the bones in a beautiful marble tomb, and immediately the donations started pouring in. King Edward I even visited the tomb a century later and had the bones wrapped in silk. Nobody seemed to care that the whole thing was painfully obviously a scam. The bones were suspiciously large. The cross was clearly a 12th century forgery, and the fact that Arthur supposedly died centuries before plate armor or chivalric knights even existed didn't bother anyone. They wanted a legendary king, so they bought one. Literally. It just goes to show you that 1,000 years ago, human nature wasn't all that different. We want the world to be more magical, more Adamitic, and more interesting than it really is. And if the real kings are just boring, inbred, and bad at managing the economy, well, we'll just invent new ones. Kings with magic swords, popes with secret babies, and emperors with dog-headed security guards. Let's leave the dusty, fraudulent bones of King Arthur behind and take a slow, quiet walk into the dense, damp forests of medieval England. Because when medieval people weren't busy inventing perfect kings to rule over them, they were busy inventing perfect outlaws to save them. Which brings us to a man who absolutely, categorically, never existed, but who somehow has a massive statue in Nottingham and 100 movies made about him. Robin Hood. Now, if you ask anyone today who Robin Hood was, they will give you the standard Hollywood resume. He was a displaced Saxon nobleman. Maybe the Earl of Hunt. He went on crusade with Richard the Lionheart, came back to find his lands stolen by the evil Prince John and the Sheriff of Nottingham, and so he moved to Sherwood Forest. There, he wore very flattering green tights, romanced Maid Marian, and famously robbed from the rich to give to the poor. It is a beautiful, romantic story about medieval social justice. It is also complete and utter nonsense. The original Robin Hood, the one who first appeared in scribbled poems and dusty ballads in the 13th and 14th centuries, was not a nobleman. He was a yeoman, which is basically a middle-class commoner. And more importantly, he did not rob from the rich to give to the poor. He robbed from everyone to give to Robin Hood. The earliest surviving ballads, like A Jest of Robin Hood, describe a guy who was frankly just a bit of a menace. He didn't live in Sherwood Forest. Originally, he lived in Barnes. He didn't care about Prince John or King Richard. The whole good king versus bad king political drama was bolted onto the story centuries later by Tudor playwrights who needed a clean, patriotic narrative. The original Robin Hood was just a grumpy highwayman who hated the local sheriff, loved the Virgin Mary, and enjoyed shooting deer that didn't belong to him. He was essentially a 14th century sovereign citizen who refused to pay taxes and lived in the woods. And his famous crew, the Merry Men, they were cobbled together from entirely different, unrelated stories. Friar Tuck, for example, was actually based on a completely different historical mythor. Possibly a real, highly aggressive rogue priest who operated in a different county 50 years later. Maid Marian didn't even exist in the English stories until the 16th century. She was originally a character in French pastoral plays, totally unrelated to Robin Hood. She was basically imported across the English Channel because the later writers realized Robin was spending entirely too much time in the woods with a bunch of sweaty dudes and no romantic subplot. But the peasants of medieval England absolutely loved him. And you can see why. If you are a 14th century farmer, legally tied to the land, giving half your crops to a lord who has never even learned your name, the idea of a guy hiding in the forest, shooting the sheriff's men, and getting away with it, that is pure fantasy fulfillment. They didn't care that he wasn't real. They needed him to be real. They needed to believe that somewhere out there, someone was actually winning. Let's gently float away from the damp woods of England and drift south, over the Channel, over the rolling hills of France, and up into the crisp, quiet, freezing air of the Swiss Alps. We are going to the early 14th century, a time when Switzerland wasn't really Switzerland yet, but rather a collection of cantons heavily annoyed by their overlords, the House of Habsburg. The Habsburgs. We talk about them a lot on this channel, usually because of their tragic genetics and their lower jaws, which eventually began to resemble a poorly packed suitcase. But long before they were aggressively inbreeding in Spain, they were just regular, overly ambitious Austrian nobles trying to control the Alpine trade routes. According to legend, the Habsburgs sent a particularly nasty bailiff named Albrecht Gessler to rule over the region of Uri. Gessler was the ultimate tyrannical middle manager, to humiliate the local populace and assert his dominance. He supposedly took his own hat. A regular, probably mildly sweaty hat, put it on top of a large pole in the middle of the town square in Alt, and decreed that every single local who walked past it had to bow to the hat. Just imagine the sheer, petty arrogance of this. Bow to my hat, peasants. It is absolute peak medieval behavior. Enter our hero, William Tell. Tell is described as a rugged, stoic mountaineer and an absolute savant with a crossbow. One day, Tell comes walking into town, holding his young son by the hand. He walks right past the pole. He does not bow to the hat, either because he is fiercely independent or because bowing to a hat on a stick is objectively ridiculous. Gessler's guards immediately arrest him. Gessler, being a creative psychopath, decides to have some fun. He tells Tell that he will let him and his son go free on one condition. Tell has to take his crossbow, stand 120 paces away, and shoot an apple off his own son's head. Let's just pause and appreciate the parenting choice here. Hold still, son. Dad needs to prove a point to the local magistrate. According to the story, Tell calmly takes 2 bolts for his crossbow. He puts one in his belt. He loads the other, takes aim, and fires. The bolt cleanly splits the apple in half. The crowd goes wild. The son is miraculously Gessler is impressed, but he notices the second bolt. He asks, Tell, hey, out of curiosity, why did you grab 2 arrows? And Tell, with the coldest, most dramatic delivery in fake medieval history, looks at him and says, if the first bolt had struck my child, the second one was meant for your heart, and I would not have missed. It is a fantastic scene. It's cinematic. It perfectly captures the rebellious Swiss spirit. It inspired an entire nation, countless paintings, and a really famous overture by Rossini that gets used in every cartoon chase scene ever made. There is just one tiny problem. William Tell did not exist. The entire story is a complete fabrication. There is absolutely no historical record of a William Tell or a bailiff named Gessler living in that region in the 14th century. But it gets worse. The Swiss didn't even invent the story. They stole, Italiano, the exact same story, a tyrannical ruler forcing an expert archer to shoot an apple off his son's head. The archer taking 2 arrows. And giving the exact same snarky response appears in a Danish historical text called the Gesta Danorum, written about 300 years earlier. In the Danish version, the archer's name is Toki Palnatuki, and the tyrant is King Harald Bluetooth. Yes, the guy the wireless technology is named after. The Swiss basically just took a Viking folktale, swapped the longbow for a crossbow, changed the names, added a fancy hat on a pole, and claimed it as their founding national myth. And people believed it so fiercely that well into the 19th century, if you went to Switzerland and publicly suggested William Tell was a myth, you could literally be run out of town. People need their heroes, even if those heroes are just imported Danish folklore. Let's slowly cross back over the mountains, drifting lazily back toward England, because we can't talk about fake medieval legends without talking about the ultimate PR stunt gone wrong. A story that blends deep piety, excessive taxation, and public nudity. We are going to the town of Coventry in the 11th century. Now, unlike Robin Hood or William Tell, the main character of this story actually did exist. Her name was Gadjifu, though history remembers her as Lady Gad. She was a real, very wealthy, very pious, Anglo-Saxon noblewoman. She and her husband Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, were huge patrons of the church. They funded monasteries, they donated land. They were basically the medieval equivalent of a high society power couple. But according to the legend that sprang up a couple of centuries after they died, Leofric had a fatal flaw. He loved taxing his peasants. He taxed them for everything, and the people of Coventry were suffering. Lady Godiva, being a kind and gentle soul, constantly begged her husband to lower the taxes. She pleaded with him day and night. Leofric, please, the peasants are starving. Leofric, please, cut the tolls. Finally, Leo, who was probably just tired of his wife nagging him while he was trying to eat his boiled mutton, snapped. He decided to call her bluff. He told her, in what was definitely meant to be a sarcastic, impossible challenge, "Fine, I will lower the taxes, but only if you ride completely naked on a horse from one end of the town market to the other." It was the classic move of a husband trying to shut down an argument by introducing a ridiculous hypothetical. He drastically underestimated his wife's commitment to the bit, because Godiva allegedly looked at him and said, "Challenge accepted." She sent out a decree to the townspeople of Coventry. She told them her plan and ordered everyone to stay indoors, close their shutters, and not look out their windows, out of respect for her modesty. Then she let down her famously long hair to cover herself as best she could, climbed onto her horse, and took the most awkward, drafty ride in English history. Leofric, completely stunned that his wife actually called his bluff, kept his word and abolished the crippling taxes. A massive win for the peasants and a deeply embarrassing day for the Earl of Mercia. It is a great story. It shows the sacrifice of the elite for the common man. It's romantic in a weird, voyeuristic way. But, of course, it never happened. The story doesn't appear in any contemporary records. It didn't show up until about 200 years after Godiva's death, invented by monks who were probably trying to spice up their local abbey's tourist appeal. In reality, Coventry was just a tiny, muddy settlement at the time, not a bustling town with a massive market. And Leofric, while a tough ruler, wasn't known for bizarre, exhibitionist bets. But the best part of the Godiva myth, the part that proves just how much people love to embellish a story, didn't even get added until the 17th century. Hundreds of years later, someone decided the story wasn't quite weird enough. So they invented a new character. They decided that while everyone in Coventry respectfully kept their eyes shut during Godiva's ride, there was one guy who just couldn't help himself. A tailor named Thomas. He allegedly drilled a hole in his shutters to sneak a peek at the naked countess. But as soon as he looked, the wrath of God struck him down, and he was instantly blinded. And thus, Peeping Tom was born. An entirely fictional character, added to an entirely fictional event, starring a real woman who would have been absolutely horrified to know that 1,000 years later, she was famous mostly for a naked horseback ride that she never actually took. It's just another reminder that history is often less about what actually happened, and more about what the people left behind really wanted to be true. Whether it's a tax-free outlaw in the woods, a flawless archer in the Alps, or a noblewoman willing to freeze on a horse to lower the local property rates. We've talked about fake kings, fake popes, and fake outlaws. But what about fake ancestors, the ones that royal families deliberately invented, not to make themselves look good, but to explain why they were so incredibly, fundamentally awful? If you look at the genealogies of European royalty, they all try to trace their lineage back to someone impressive. King David, Charlemagne, maybe a Roman emperor, but the House of Lusignan, a massively powerful noble family from the Poitou region of France, went in a completely different direction. They looked at their own chaotic, violent, deeply dysfunctional family dynamic, and they decided, you know what? There's only one logical explanation for us. Our great-great-grandmother was a magical water snake, enter Melcene. The legend of Melcene is one of the most bizarre pieces of dynastic propaganda in medieval history. According to the story, sometime in the dark, misty past, a nobleman named Raymond of Poitou was out hunting in the forest. He got lost, as medieval nobles frequently did because maps were mostly just suggestions back then. And in the middle of the woods, by a beautiful, sparkling fountain, he met the most gorgeous woman he had ever seen. Her name was Melcene. Raymond, being a standard medieval aristocrat, immediately proposed to her, because why bother getting to know someone when you have land to manage? Melcene agreed to marry him, and she promised to bring him unimaginable wealth and power. But she had one very specific, completely non-negotiable condition. Raymond had to promise that he would never, under any circumstances, try to see her on a Saturday. Saturday was her day. No visitors, no husband, no interruptions. Now, if someone tells you today that they need a strict 24-hour period of complete isolation once a week with 0 questions asked, you might assume they just really value their alone time. But in the Middle Ages, this was a massive red flag. Still, Raymond agreed, because she was beautiful and he was entirely lacking in common sense. They get married, and immediately, Melcene proves her worth. According to the legend, she used her fairy magic to build massive, impenetrable castles overnight. The fortress of Lusignan just sprouted from the ground. She brought Raymond immense wealth. And, importantly for a noble family, she provided him with 10 sons. But here is where the story gets incredibly weird and highly specific. The sons were not normal. In fact, they were walking genetic disasters. One son, Urien, was born with one red eye and one green eye, and ears that were massively oversized. Another son, Antoine, had a birthmark on his cheek shaped exactly like a lion's paw, complete with actual claws. Then there was Geoffroy, who was born with a single, massive boar's tusk protruding from his mouth. If you are a medieval historian reading this, you are probably thinking, ah, yes, the classic results of centuries of aggressive cousin marriage. But the Lusignians didn't want to admit that their bloodline was basically a shallow puddle. So they leaned into the myth. The kids were weird because their mother was magic. For years, the marriage works out. Raymond honors the Saturday rule. But eventually, Raymond's brother comes to visit, and his brother, being the medieval equivalent of a toxic podcast host, starts planting seeds of doubt. He tells Raymond, you know, she's probably seeing another man on Saturdays, or doing dark magic. You really should check. So, Raymond, unable to resist a terrible idea, goes to Melcene's private chambers on a Saturday. He looks through the keyhole of her door, and there he sees his beautiful wife taking a bath. Except, from the waist down, she isn't a woman. She is a massive, scaly, terrifying serpent. Some versions say a dragon, some say a fish. But either way, she is definitely not human. Raymond is shocked, but he actually keeps his mouth shut for a while. He pretends he didn't see anything, because honestly, she's still building castles and managing the estate, so why ruin a good thing? But later, one of their monstrous sons, Geoffroy, with a giant tooth, goes on a rampage and burns down a monastery, killing his own brother in the process. Just standard royal sibling rivalry. Raymond is furious, and in front of his entire court, he loses his temper and yells at Melcene, calling her a false serpent who polluted his bloodline. Melcene is heartbroken. The secret is out. The boundary has been crossed. She turns into a massive dragon, lets out a tragic, shrieking cry, and flies out the window of the castle, never to be seen as a human again. Though according to the family, she would occasionally fly back and wail over the castle towers whenever a member of the Lusignan family was about to die. Basically a scaly medieval smoke detector for impending doom. Now, why does this matter? Because the House of Lusignan, who eventually became kings of Jerusalem and Cyprus, treated this story as absolute historical fact, and the Plantagenets of England kings like Henry II and Richard the Lionheart, who were related to the family, also adopted the myth. They used it to excuse their legendary anger issues. Richard the Lionheart used to joke about it. He would say, "From the devil we sprang, and to the devil we shall go." It was the ultimate royal cope. "Sorry, I just burned down your village and threw a goblet at the archbishop's head. I can't help it. I'm a quarter water snake." They took a fictional monster and turned her into a historical elite, just to avoid going to therapy. Let's drift away from the screaming dragon mothers of France and float gently over the channel to a quiet, sleepy village in Suffolk, England. The village of Woolpit. The 12th century. This is a time when the boundary between the natural world and the supernatural world was basically non-existent. If your crops failed, it was witches. If you got sick, your humors were unbalanced. And if two completely green children crawled out of a hole in the ground, well, you just put them in the local ledger and went about your day. According to chroniclers like William of Newburgh and Ralph of Cagichel, who were serious, educated men, not fiction writers, during the reign of King Stephen, reapers working in the fields of Woolpit found two children wandering near some ancient wolf-trapping pits. The children, a boy and a girl, were entirely normal in their shape and size, but their skin was a deep, leafy green. Their clothes were made of weird, unfamiliar materials, and they spoke a language that absolutely no one could understand. The villagers, who had probably never seen anything more exotic than a bruised turnip, took the children to the home of a local knight, Sir Richard de Carlin. The children were terrified, and more importantly, they were starving. But they refused to eat any of the food the medieval cooks offered them. Bread, meat, cheese, they just cried and pushed it away. 4 days, they starved, until someone brought in some freshly cut beanstalks. The children practically lunged at them. They tore open the stalks, looking for the beans, and ate them raw. For months, it was the only thing they would eat. Just a strictly raw, broad bean diet. Eventually, the tragic reality of medieval child mortality set in. The boy, who was always the younger and weaker of the two, became deeply depressed, fell ill, and died. Because living in a damp English manor, house on a diet of raw vegetables, is not conducive to a long life. But the girl survived. Slowly, she was coaxed into eating normal food. And as she started eating regular, presumably boiled and unseasoned English food, her skin gradually lost its green tint and turned a normal, pale color. She learned to speak English, and eventually she was asked where on earth she came from. Her answer was beautifully, perfectly bizarre. She claimed that she and her brother came from a place called St. Martin's Land, a subterranean world where there was no sun, only a constant, endless twilight. Everyone in St. Martin's Land was green. She said they had been tending their father's sheep when they heard a loud noise, like the ringing of bells. They wandered into a cave, got lost in the darkness, and eventually climbed out into the blinding, terrifying sunlight of Suffolk. The girl supposedly grew up, got baptized, and eventually married a man at King's Lynn. Some accounts say she was incredibly loose and wanton in her behavior, which is probably just a medieval monk's way of saying she had a personality. But the fascinating part of this story isn't just the fairy tale. It's the fact that the elites of the time treated it as completely real. These chroniclers wrote about the green children in the same history books where they recorded the deaths of kings and the outcomes of wars. They didn't know how to explain it, so they just accepted it as a weird footnote in local history. Modern historians, of course, have to ruin the fun. They suggest that children were probably just Flemish immigrants who had been orphaned, got lost in the woods, and were suffering from chlorosis, a type of severe anemia brought on by malnutrition that can give the skin a greenish tint. A tragic, very human story. But to the medieval mind, they were magical beings from a twilight world, because a magical world is much easier to process than a world where children just starve in the woods. Let's slowly drift from the twilight fields of England over the dark, rolling waves of the North Sea, and land gently in Germany. The town of Hamelin, the year is 1284. We all know the story of the Pied Piper. It is a staple of childhood fairy tales. The town is overrun with rats. A mysterious man arrives, wearing a coat of many colored or pied patches. He tells the mayor he can get rid of the rats for a fee. The mayor agrees. The man pulls out a pipe, plays a magical tune, and all the rats follow him into the Vesa River and drown. Then, the medieval elites do what medieval elites do best. They refuse to pay the bill. They try to shortchange the freelancer. The piper leaves in a rage. He returns on June 26th, the feast of Saints John and Paul. While the adults are all sitting in the church, he starts playing a different tune. And 'tis time, it's not the rats that follow him. It is the children. 130 boys and girls dance out of the town, follow the piper into a cave, and vanish forever. Only 3 children are left behind. 1 blind, 1 lame, and 1 deaf, who couldn't keep up or hear the music. It is a terrifying, haunting story. But here is the strange part. While the magical piper in his colorful tights never existed, the event he supposedly caused was treated by the town of Hamelin as a very real, very historical tragedy. The town was so traumatized by whatever actually happened in 1284 that they established a law. No music or dancing was ever allowed to be performed on the street where the children were last seen. It was called the Bungalow sen Strasse, or the street without drums. They even dated their official town documents from the event. In the year 1384, it is 100 years since our children left. So what really happened if there was no magical flute player? Where did the kids go? Some historians think it was a localized plague, and the pipo was just a metaphor for death, dancing the children to the grave. Others think it might have been a mass emigration. The children might have just been the young people of the town, recruited by a charismatic locator, wearing bright clothes, a medieval real estate agent. Basically to move east to colonize places like Transylvania or Moravia, where there was more land and fewer terrible mayors. But a town losing an entire generation of its youth to a bad immigration policy or a plague is a massive civic failure. It is deeply embarrassing for the local lords. So, over the decades, the story shifted. It wasn't our fault the children left. We were tricked. Tricked by a magical, vengeful phantom with a flute. It is the ultimate municipal cover-up, turned a bureaucratic disaster into a ghost story. And suddenly, you aren't the worst mayor in Germany. You're just the victim of a supernatural contractor dispute. We've already talked about the panic-inducing myth of Pope Joan, our favorite fictional female pontiff, but the medieval world had plenty of other imaginary women and completely fake heroes ready to terrify, inspire, or most importantly scam. The local elites, because if there is one thing medieval nobility loved more than aggressive taxation, it was a really expensive, highly questionable holy relic. Which brings us to a woman who supposedly existed, supposedly died a tragic death, and supposedly took an entire mid-sized city's worth of women with her. San Ursula. Now, the legend of Saint Ursula starts out like a fairly standard, slightly dramatic medieval fairy tale. According to the stories that started circulating wildly around the 10th century, Ursula was a Romano-British princess. She was beautiful. She was incredibly pious. And she was, of course, betrothed to a pagan king whom she absolutely did not want to marry. So, she does what any reasonable princess looking to buy some time would do. She asks for a 3-year delay on the wedding, and she demands that her fiancé provide her with 10 noble ladies, and then she demands that each of those 10 ladies, plus herself, be provided with 1,000 companions. If you are doing the medieval math, that is 11,000 virgins, just packing their bags, getting on a fleet of ships, and going on a massive 3-year European cruise. Now, logistics were not the medieval storyteller's strong suit. Just the sheer amount of hardtack and salted fish required to feed 11,000 people on a fleet of ships is staggering. Where did they sleep? How did they manage the plumbing? Nobody knows. Because in medieval legends, people don't need to eat. They just need to be tragically martyred. According to the story, Ursula and her massive entourage sail across the sea, travel up the Rhine River, and end up in the city of Cologne, Germany. Unfortunately for them, Cologne happens to be under siege by the Huns. The Huns, who are not known for their hospitality, immediately captured the women. The leader of the Huns takes one look at Ursula, falls in love, and offers to spare her life if she will marry him. Ursula, sticking to her principles, politely declines. So, the Huns shoot her with an arrow, and then proceed to massacre all 11,000 of her companions. It is a bloodbath, a terrible, sweeping, romanticized tragedy that the Middle Ages just absolutely adored. But here is the best part. Ursula and her 11,000 virgins almost certainly never existed. At least, not like that. The entire legend, this massive, sweeping epic that generated hundreds of paintings, entirely new religious orders, and endless pilgrimages, was basically the result of a clerical typo. In the early days of the church, there was an inscription found in Cologne, referencing a small group of local martyrs. It mentioned a woman named Ursula and her companions. The inscription likely read CM. Now, in Latin, shorthand, that stands for Undecim Martyrs, Virgins 11 Martyred, Virgins 11. A completely reasonable number of people to have in a local tragic event. But somewhere along the line, a monk with a very active imagination and a poor grasp of acronyms read CMV and decided the M didn't stand for martyrs. He decided it stood for milia, thousands. Suddenly, 11 tragic victims became 11,000. Because why let facts get in the way of a blockbuster story? And the city of Cologne realized they had struck absolute gold. Because in the year 1106, the city was expanding its walls, and workers started digging up an old, forgotten Roman graveyard. There were bones everywhere, thousands of them. Instead of saying, "Ah, an ancient Roman cemetery, let's respectfully pave over it," the church authorities looked at the bones, remembered the typo about the 11,000 virgins, and essentially said, "Jackpot." They immediately declared that they had found the mass grave of Saint Ursula's entourage, and thus began one of the most lucrative, cynical, and highly organized facrelic scams in European history. The monks of Cologne started selling these bones to royal courts, monasteries, and wealthy nobles all over Europe. Everyone wanted a piece of an authentic virgin martyr. They sold skulls, they sold femurs, they sold ribs. They boxed them up in beautiful, gold leaf reliquaries and shipped them out for massive profits. It was a booming industry. The only problem was, they were literally just digging up whatever they could find in a random Roman dirt pit. Fast forward a few centuries, when people actually started examining these holy relics, and they realized something awkward. A lot of TC virgin martyrs were actually the bones of large, burly Roman men. Worse, some of them were the bones of large, burly Roman dogs. Just imagine being a very pious, very wealthy French duke. You've spent a fortune on a golden box containing the sacred rib of one of Ursula's holy companions. You pray to it every day, and it turns out you've been whispering your deepest, darkest political secrets to the femur of a 2nd century mastiff. It is the perfect medieval story. A fake princess, a massive clerical error, and a thriving economy based entirely on selling dog bones to gullible aristocrats. Let's slowly drift away from the bone markets of Cologne. We are going to make one final stop tonight. We are going to visit the man who basically wrote the medieval internet, a man who claimed to have seen it all, done it all, and met every fake king and monster we've talked about tonight. His name was Sir John Mandeville. If you were a king, a queen, or just a mildly literate merchant in the 14th century, you had a copy of the Travels of Sir John Mandeville. It was translated into every major European language. Christopher Columbus read it. Leonardo da Vinci read it. It was the absolute, undisputed authority on what the rest of the world looked like. In his book, Mandeville introduces himself as a humble English knight from the town of St. Albans. He claims that he crossed the sea in the year 1322 and basically went on a 34-year gap year across the known and unknown world. He claimed to have served in the army of the Sultan of Egypt. He claimed to have traveled through India, China, and the mystical kingdom of Prester John, who, as we established earlier tonight, was a complete fabrication. But Mandeville didn't care. He wrote about Prester John's gravel sea, a massive ocean made entirely of rolling stones instead of water. Mandeville's book was a masterpiece of deadpan, flat delivery of the absolute most unhinged things you have ever heard. He wrote about his travels with the quiet, bored authority of a guy reviewing a moderately priced hotel. He described encountering the blimmies, a race of men who had no heads, but instead had their faces located right in the middle of their chests. He described the Seapodes men who had only one massive umbrella-like foot. When it got too sunny, they would just lie on their backs and hold their one giant foot up to shade themselves. Who's a casual, everyday observation from a wandering English knight. He wrote about giant snails whose shells were so large that multiple people could live inside them. He described a magical fountain of youth, which he casually mentioned he drank from a few times, noting that he felt the better for it. He even described trees that, instead of growing fruit, grew tiny, adorable little lambs attached to the branches by their belly buttons. You just cut the stem, and boom, fresh mutton. And the European elites believed every single word. Why wouldn't they? The world was a huge, scary, unknown place. If an English knight said there were chest-faced people and lamb trees out there, who were they to argue? But, as I'm sure you have already guessed, Sir John Mandeville did not exist. There was no knight from St. Albans. There was no 34-year journey. The entire book, the most famous travelogue of the Middle Ages, was completely plagiarized. Modern historians are pretty sure the book was written by a guy, probably a French physician or a cleric, sitting in a very comfortable, very stationary library in France. He just took real accounts from actual missionaries who had gone to Asia, mixed them together with ancient Roman and threw in a bunch of local folklore, and slapped the fake name of an English knight on the cover. He was essentially an armchair traveler who managed to convince the entire Western world that he had personally hung out with dog-headed men. He is the patron saint of making things up on your resume. And in a way, Sir John Mandeville perfectly summarizes everything we have talked about tonight. The fake empires of Prester John, the forged papal drama of Pope Joan, the convenient tourist-wrap bones of King Arthur and Saint Ursula, the leafy green children, and the tax-evading outlaws. None of it was real, but all of it was true, in a way. It was true to what the medieval mind needed. They lived in a world of plague, famine, crushing inequality, and endless, boring, dynastic wars. They needed a world that was bigger than their mud-wattle huts and their drafty stone castles. They needed to believe that somewhere out there was a perfect king ruling a peaceful empire. They needed to believe that outlaws could be noble, that queens could ride naked to save the poor, and that if things got really bad, you could just blame a magical piper or a dragon mother for your problems. They were inventing a reality that was vastly more interesting than their own. And honestly, looking at the internet today, we really haven't changed that much. We just traded lamb trees for targeted ads. So, as we finally close the heavy, dusty book on these phantom kings, imaginary knights, and fictional queens, I want you to let go of the need for facts. Let go of the dates, the timelines, and the historical records. Let your mind wander into that dark, quiet, mythical forest where the castles sprout overnight and the legendary kings are always sleeping, just waiting to be woken up. Picture this. It's the 2nd century BC. Emperor Wu's got his eyes on the world, and Zhang Qian's fresh back from scouting Central Asia. The Silk Road isn't some glamorous highways, a 4,000-mile slog of sandstorms, altitude sickness, and merchants who probably smelled like fermented regret. These guys, mostly from places like Chang'an, Xi'an, weren't packing gourmet kitchens. They needed food that was instant, shelf-stable, and idiot-proof. No fire, no problem. Soggy rice ball, luxury. We'll float through 15 of these forgotten bites, one merchant tale at a time, with all the gritty details that make history feel like a half-remembered dream, starting with the basics. Our first merchant. Let's call him Lao Wei, a fictional stand-in for the real ones, trudging from Dunhuang to Samarkand around 100 AD. Lao Wei's crew hauled silk boats, lacquerware, and iron tools. But their real cargo was survival chow. Meal number 1. Dried millet cakes. Millet was the everyman's grain back then, seep, drought-proof, and grown everywhere from the Yellow River Plains to the Gobi Fringes. They'd harvest it, grind it coarse, mix with minimal water, pat into flat discs, and sun-dry them rock-hard. Instant slam a cake against a rock to crumble it, soak in whatever liquid you had, camel urine in a pinch, because why not, and mush it into a paste. No cooking needed if you were lazy, which Lao Wei always was. These cakes traveled light, lasting months without molding. Historical records from the Astric Wilu, a 3rd century guide for traders, mention millet as the backbone of Silk Road diets, packed in bamboo tubes or wrapped in oiled cloth. Lao Wei would wake at dawn in a caravanserai near Turfan, crack a cake with his boot heel, and let it soften in his canteen while haggling over rhubarb roots with Uyghur middlemen. Flavor, bland as a diplomat's promise, maybe spiked with salt from the lop, nor salt flats, but it filled the gut. One text from the Han Dynasty describes merchants eating 2 to 3 cakes a day, totaling about 1,500 calories if you were optimistic. Lao Wei, being a bit rounder than most, probably doubled up. Why millet over rice? Rice was for fancy folks. Back home, too heavy. Spoiled easy. Millet was tough. Like the merchants. Float to a side note. Emperor Wu himself pushed millet cultivation to feed his armies, so these traders were basically munching subsidized patriotism. Lao Wei once traded a whole sack for a Sogdian horse that bolted at the first sandstorm. Of course it did. He'd sit by the fireless camp, gnawing a softened lump, pondering life's injustices while his partner snored. Gentle rhythm to it. Right. Chew. Swallow. Repeat. No drama. Just sustenance. Next up, meal 2. Fermented soybean paste balls. These were the umami bomb of the road. Soybeans, native to ancient China, got boiled, mashed, salted, and fermented into a thick jung paste. Think proto-miso. But merchants rolled it into walnut-sized balls, dusted with ash or dried herbs for longevity. Instant factor. Pop one in your mouth. Let the funk explode. Chase with water. Lao Wei swore by them after a bout of what he called gobi gripes. Records from the *Shigi* hint at soy ferments, dating back to 1000 BC, but Silk Road versions were portable, traded even to Lao Wei's routine. Break camp at Hami Oasis, unwrap his cloth bundle of 20 bowls, eat 2 for breakfast. They packed protein like nobody's business victual when you're losing 10% body weight to dysentery. Sarcastic aside, imagine the smell after a week in 100-degree heat. His donkey loved it. Though still won, and it'd follow you to historical perk. These balls doubled as currency. Swap a handful for fermented mare's milk from nomads. Lao Wei got fleeced once, trading prime balls for curdled junk. Typical. Meal 3. Parched wheat kernels. Wheat entered China via the road itself, hybridized from Central Asian strains. Poach it roast over low coals till crunchy, then store in leather pouches. Instant meal. Hung fills straight down the hatch, like nature's trail mix. Lao Wei favored mixing with raisins bartered from Bactria, creating a sad protogram. The asterisk, who Hanshu asterisk chronicles wheat as a Silk Road staple by the Eastern Han era, lightweight and energy-dense, at 350 calories per 100 grams. Dawn at the Jade Gate. Lao Wei grabs a fistful, crunches while saddling up. No prep, no fuss. It kept teeth busy, which was key. Silk Road smiles weren't pretty. One kernel at a time, he'd pondered the caravan ahead, stretching to Houghton for jade. Boring, sure, but that's the vibe. His partner grumbled about grit from the pouches. Lao Wei just shrugged. Extra fiber. Meal 4. Dried radish strips. Radishes from the North China plains, sliced thin, sun-dried till leathery. Chew like jerky. Rehydrate if you're fancy. Instant, fibrous, and vitamin-packed. Against scurvy. Lao Wei sliced his own at home, trading excess for donkey fodder. Tang Dynasty poems romanticize radish on the road, but it was peasant food elevated by necessity. He'd munch these mid-afternoon, when the sun baked the taklamakan's edges. Tangy bite cut the millet monotony. Once, a sandstorm hit. Lao Wei hunkered with his strips, trading bites for stories from a Kashmiri trader. Survival poetry, softly told. Meal 5. Honeyed date paste rolls. Dates trickled in from Persia. Sticky mash with wild honey from Sichuan bees. Roll in millet flour. Dry into bars. Lao Wei hoarded these for morale boost sugar rush without the crash. Asterisk compendium of materia medica. Asterisk by Li Shijin later praises, dates for stamina. But merchants knew it first. Evening halt near Dunhuang Caves. Unwrap a roll. Savor the chew. Lao Wei shared with a monk once, sparking a chat about Buddha's own travels. Sticky fingers, sleepy vibes. Lao Wei's caravan merges with others at the Great Wall's end. Meal 6. Sesame seed bricks. Sesame oil plants boomed under the Hans. Seeds roasted, pressed into slabs with honey or malt. Instant. Snap off a chunk. Crunch away. High-fat 4 cold nights in the Tian Shanpas. Texts, like the asterisk book, of Wei asterisk note sesame, trades to the west, fueling merchants like Lao Wei. He portioned 1 brick per day, oily satisfaction amid dry winds. Sarcasm alert. Nothing like sesame breath to charm a turkey wife at the bazaar. It stuck to teeth, but energy lasted. Meal 7. Rehydratable rice, flour dough. Rice flour pounded fine, steamed briefly at home, dried into sheets. Tear, soak, eat as porridge. Lao Wei's wife prepped stacks. He'd revive 1 in yak milk. From nomads. Han records show rice flour portability key for long hauls. Midday slump near Turpin. Lao Wei soaks a sheet, stirs to goo. Bland comfort, like hugging your gran. 1 sheet fed him through a hailstorm rice. Never fails. Meal 8. Pickled mustard green bundles. Mustard greens brined in vinegar from Shaanxi, bundled tight, dried. Unfurl, chew, sour strips. Instant probiotics. Got armor. Lao Wei traded greens for lapis lazuli, regretting it later. Chew by firelight. Tailies of Chang'an flow. Pickled Thames, cut grease. Meal 9. Almond millet clusters. Almonds from Tarim groves, clustered with millet paste, dried hard. Smash and eat. Nuts added luxury. Lao Wei splurged postile. Afternoon graze near Kucha. Clusta. Crumbles satisfy. His donkey eyed them, jealously smart beast. Meal 10. Fermented barley curd cakes. Barley from Tibetan edges, curdled with wild yeasts. Dried flat. Soak 2. Yogurt like mush. Lao Wei's secret for road belly. Deeper into the road. Lao Wei barters at Houghton. Meal 11. Apricot fruit leather. Apricots dried whole or pureed into sheets from Fergana imports. Instant chew. Vitamin C. Gold against rickets. Lao Wei layered leathers. 4 weeks worth. Sweetheart wake up. Meal 12. Goji berry chews. Goji for Ningxia sundrade. Strung like beads. Pop berries. Antioxidants galore. Lao Wei snacked during sand drifts. Meal 13. Walnut paste balls. Walnuts cracked, pasted with honey, rolled dry. Brain food. 4. Haggling. Evening unwind. Ball by ball. Lao Wei dreams of home. Meal 14. Dried lotus root crisps. Lotus sliced thin, dried crisp. Crunchy Nutrobase. Meal 15. Final wild cardamom bean noodles. Pre-boiled, dried coiled, uncoil, soak, slurp, cold. Lao Wei reaches Samarkand, belly full of history's fast food. Faith to Islip. Lao Wei presses on. The Taklamakan's whispery dunes, flanking the caravan like judgmental ants. We've covered the basics, but millet cakes had cousins endless tweaks for the road-weary. Meal variation 6.5, if you will. Millet with wild onion flakes. Those onions, foraged from oases or bartered from Kong herders, got dried 2 brittle threads and crumbled into the millet dough before patting flat. Lao Wei's batch came from a shady dealer in Dunhuang who swore they were imported from the gods. Probably just local weeds, but the faint zing made the mush tolerable. Historical nudge. The asterisk Hanshu asterisk lists wild alliums as caravan staples. Cheap flavor for bland grains. He'd crumble a flake-studded cake at noon. The onion ghosting his breath through afternoon deals no pot nade. The sun did the work back home. Lao Wei once ate a whole one betting against a sandstorm, lost the bet. Gained heartburn. Of course, he did. Soft chew after soaking, rhythmic as camel steps. Drift to meal 16 weight. We're past 15. Nah, these are bonus forgotten bites. because Silk Road merchants didn't count. Dried mung bean sprouts, mung beans sprouted quick in damp cloth sacks, then sun-dried into twiggy clusters, instant. Soak briefly, munch freshest greens, vitamin boost against the endless beige diet. Laue sprouted his in camp, timing it between Marat. Morning ritual near Miran ruins, handful of revived sprouts, crisp and earth. Tang Records shows sprout tech for nomads, adopted by traders. His partner hated the rabbit food, but Laue thrived less gout. Mill 17. Persimmon leather sheets, persimmons from Shanxi groves, pulped, spread thin, dried glossy, chewy sweet, tannin puckering. Laue rolled them tight, unspooling like edible scrolls. Benkao Gungimu praises persimmons for digestion perfect post-spice binge. Afternoon unwind at a yurt cluster. Sheet by sheet, sticky joy. Traded one for a dagger he never used dimples by. Laue's days blurred. Rise at false dawn. Millet crumble for energy. Mung Nibel mid-March. Camels, laden with silk bolts, groaned in sympathy. Sarcastic aside, those beasts ate better than him sometimes. Fresh tamarisk twigs while he fought crumbs. The caravan hits Yarkand oasis, water like liquid gold. Meal 18, Gartley fermenteth tofu bits. Tofu, that Hanera wonder from soybean curd, got chunked, brined, with garlic and salt, dried hard. Instant funk bomb nibble, dry or soak. Laue's supply, wrapped in lotus leaves, lasted from Xi'an. Records from the Kui Min Jiao. Su 6th century, but roots earlier detail tofu portability. He popped one evenings, garlic punch clearing sinuses. Nomad kids begged for them, eyes wide at the reek. Laue played dad, sharing sparingly. Meal 19. Hawthorn berry paste sticks. Hawthorn from northern hills, boiled to paste. Honey-bound, dried rod-shaped. Tart chew for sweet tooths. Laue Nord during altitude climbs to the Pamirs. Sugar-fueling legs, slow bites by campfire, stars indifferent overhead. Hawthorn traded well Persians, called it heaven fruit. Meal 20. Buckwheat pancakes, prepped flat and old. Buckwheat from Tibetan frontiers, ground, steamed thin, dried cracker stiff, crumbled into brothless soup. Laue favored for weight lighter than millet. Dawn at Caracol. Pancake dust in palm, wash down slow. Asterisk temp si hiao. Asterisk notes buckwheat Silk Road surge, float to Laue's quirks. He'd hoard ferments, blaming them for inner fire. His donkey concurred, avoiding him post-garlic. Nights cooled. Paste, sticks, warmed bellies. Endless road, endless nibbles. Up the tortuous Pamir trail. Air thin, appetites sharper. Meal 21. Pistachio crunch balls. Pistachios trickled from Afghan groves, roasted with sesame, balled tight, instant handful luxury. Laue bartered bolts of silk for a pouch worth it. Crunch, mid-climb, fats, staving off shivers. Sogdian traders shared recipes, smirking at his eagerness. Meal 22. Dried arrowroot tubers. Arrowroot, dug from damp valleys, sliced, sun-bleached. Powdery chew, starch surge. Laue pounded extras into flour for thickening. Chew thoughtfully at pass crests, views vast, mind foggy. Meal 23. Chrysanthemum seed snacks. Seeds toasted, mixed with honey, dried pellet. Herbal cum for frayed nerves. Laue sipped imaginary tea with each. Pamir winds howled soft. Pellets grounded him. Laue reflected, started in Chang'an Basul. Now this. Meals marked male's millet at start. Pistachios at peaks. Camels plodded. Merchants muttered tales of ancestors doing the same. Samarkand bazaars hum faintly. Meal 24. Dried quince paste. Quince from Fergana, astringent pureed slabs. Laue traded jade for stack start finale. Never limit, haggling, deal sealing chew. Meal 25. Lentil flour wafers. Lentils, ground fine, pressed, thin, baked dry, neutral base, protein punch. Laue's last resort. Wafers crumbled easy. Roads end in sight. We've wandered far, from milled mush to Pistacia Pop's 15 core, plus these echoes of forgotten flavors. Lao Wei unloads silk, pockets gold, munches one lost paste stick, homeward bound, belly wiser. Now we begin with something a little dusty, a little creaky, a little sticky under the boots. So dim the lights, maybe lower the brightness on your phone, and imagine the soft clink of glass somewhere far away. No dramatic music, no shootouts, just a slow drift back to a wooden building at the edge of the American frontier. The kind of place where the floor slants slightly, the piano is missing 2 keys, and everyone is pretending they're not exhausted from surviving another day in the 19th century. We are not here for gunfights. We are not here for heroic duels at sunset. We are here for the slow, slightly uncomfortable, deeply human reality of frontier saloon life. Because, as it turns out, most people in the Old West were not dramatic outlaws. They were tired miners, lonely cowboys, shopkeepers with back pain, and of course, a saloon owner who absolutely overcharged for watered-down whiskey, because capitalism does not sleep, even in 1873. Let's settle into a small town somewhere in the American West, maybe in the territory that would later become Arizona, or perhaps in the dusty stretches of Montana. It honestly does not matter. The buildings look the same. Wooden, hastily assembled, slightly crooked. The saloon is usually one of the first proper structures to appear, often before a church, because human priorities have always been consistent. Shelter, work, and then a place to complain about work. Inside, the air is thick. Not dramatically thick, just lived-in thick. Tobacco smoke lingers late. The bar is long and polished only in the spots where elbows have worn it smooth. Behind it stands a man who has seen everything and reacts to nothing. His mustache is either magnificent or deeply unfortunate. There is no middle ground. He pours drinks with the calm resignation of someone who knows that half his customers will pay in cash and the other half will pay next week, which means never. Now, let's talk about what they were drinking. Whiskey, yes, but not the glamorous amber liquid of modern cocktail bars. Frontier whiskey was often rough, sometimes dangerously rough. It could contain anything from burnt sugar to tobacco juice. Occasionally, less charming ingredients. It burned going down. It burned coming up. And yet, it was wildly popular. Because after a 14-hour shift, mining silver or herding cattle, refinement was not the priority. Numbness. What? The saloon was not just a bar. It was a social center, a post office, a courtroom of public opinion, a hiring hall, a rumor factory. You could learn about land deals, catlip prices, and who had run off with whose horse. Information moved slowly across the frontier, but inside the saloon, it swirled gently, like dust in a sunbeam. News from the East Coast might arrive weeks late, but someone would still argue about it confidently, because confidence has never required accuracy. Let's float gently over to the clientele. First, the cowboys. Contrary to Hollywood's dramatic version, most cowboys were young, underpaid, frequently sunburned. They spent months on cattle drives, sleeping outdoors, eating beans, and developing a profound appreciation for chairs. When they reached town, the saloon offered light, warmth, and the thrilling opportunity to sit down indoors. Their grand celebration often consisted of drinking too much, attempting to dance, and discovering that social skills do not automatically improve after 3 months with cattle. Then there were the miners. If the town existed because someone found gold or silver nearby, the saloon was practically their second home. Mining was dangerous and repetitive. Days where long the pay was uncertain. So the saloon became a place to briefly feel prosperous. A man might strike it rich one week and buy drinks for everyone. To next week he might be quietly nursing a single glass, hoping no one noticed the sudden financial collapse. Boom and bust cycles. But make it emotional. Gambling tables usually sat toward the back. Faro was popular. Poker, of course. The cards were handled by men who claimed to be honest. Some of them even were. Money changed hands in slow, steady streams. Most players lost gradually, which is the least dramatic but most realistic outcome. The professional gamblers were not flashy villains. They were patient, observant, slightly bored. They survived on the overconfidence of others, a timeless business model. Music drifted through the room in uneven waves. A piano, slightly out of tune, carried the melody. The pianist might have once studied somewhere respectable, or he might have simply known 3 songs and played them repeatedly. No one complained. The rhythm gave structure to the evening. It softened the sharp edges of conversation. Occasionally, someone would attempt to sing. It was rarely impressive, but it was enthusiastic, and in a frontier town, enthusiasm counts for something. Women in saloons existed in a complicated space. Some were entertainers, singers, or dancers. Some worked as servers. Some were independent entrepreneurs, navigating limited options in a male-dominated environment. Hollywood loves to simplify them into glamorous figures in bright dresses. Reality was quieter. Life was precarious. Respectability politics followed them everywhere. Yet many of these women were financially savvy, socially intelligent, and far more adaptable than the men loudly debating cattle prices near the bar. Let's not forget the saloon owner's daily anxiety. Liquor shipments could be delayed. Supplies might spoil. Fights might break out, which meant broken furniture. And furniture was expensive when you had to haul it across miles of rough terrain. Contrary to legend, many towns enforced weapon restrictions inside saloons. Guns were often checked at the door. This reduced chaos significantly, because while the Wild West makes for thrilling cinema, constant gunfire is terrible for business margins. As night deepened, the energy rarely exploded into cinematic drama. More often, it softened. Conversations slurred gently. Someone fell asleep at a table. Someone else stared thoughtfully into a glass, as if it contained profound life advice. Boots scraped against wooden floors. The piano slowed, and eventually, the lamps were dimmed. One by one, patrons stepped back into the cool desert air, slightly unsteady, but mostly intact. And that is the quiet truth of Frontier Saloon life. Not endless duels. Not daily showdowns. At high noon, just tired people seeking warmth, distraction, and connection at the edge of an uncertain world. A wooden building glowing softly against the darkness. A place where loneliness was briefly held at bay by bad whiskey and shared stories. So, as we settle into this gentle rhythm, imagine the door swinging closed. The bar wiped down for tomorrow. The town silent, except for distant wind. And we'll stay here a little longer. Next time, drifting deeper into the odd routines and small dramas that shape life on the frontier. Let's settle behind the bar for a moment. Because the saloon bartender was not just a drink pourer, he was part therapist, part referee, part accountant, and part furniture repair specialist. Usually, all at once. He stood there every evening, polishing the same glass in slow circles, listening to the same arguments about cattle routes, railroad expansion, or whose mule had the worst temperament. He rarely picked sides. Picking sides is bad for repeat customers. Out on the frontier, the bartender often knew more about the town's emotional health than anyone else. Who had lost money? Who had lost love? Who had lost both and was pretending otherwise? He extended credit carefully. Too much generosity meant bankruptcy. Too little meant empty stools. So he mastered the art of the firm but sympathetic nod. You'll pay me Friday. Of course he won't, but we'll say Friday. Now, let's drift toward the regulars. Every saloon had them. The man who arrived precisely at sunset, the one who claimed he almost struck gold once and just needed one more week, the retired scout who told stories that grew slightly more heroic each month, the quiet ranch hand who drank slowly and left quietly. Frontier towns were small ecosystems. Everyone knew everyone, which meant reputations stuck harder than spilled ale. There was usually a self-appointed philosopher, too, a man who, after 2 drinks, became deeply reflective about the future of the territory. He would lean heavily on the bar and predict that railroads would change everything, or that railroads would ruin everything, or both. And honestly, he wasn't entirely wrong. The arrival of the railroad did reshape towns dramatically. Some flourished. Others faded into ghostly silence. But tonight, in this saloon, the future can wait. We are focused on the present, on the glass in hand. Let's talk about money. Because while Hollywood loves a dramatic poker showdown, the real financial rhythm of a saloon was slower. Small bets, modest losses, occasional bursts of overconfidence. A cowhand might spend half a month's wages in 2 evenings, not because he was reckless, but because tomorrow was uncertain. Work was seasonal. Injury was common. Long-term savings plans were optimistic. Gambling tables were places of intense concentration, not cinematic chaos. Faro dealers flicked cards with mechanical precision. Poker players watched each other's faces for signs of hesitation. It was quiet work. Mental work. The kind that leaves you tired rather than exhilarated. Professional gamblers often traveled from town to town, following cattle drives or mining booms. They were surprisingly disciplined. Early to bed, careful with money. Not exactly the reckless desperado stereotype, more like traveling accountants with better hats. Speaking of hats, clothing inside the saloon told its own story. Wide-brimmed hats rested on pegs near the door. Dust clung to boots. Jackets were worn thin at the elbows. Wealth was visible, but subtle. A finely tailored vest. A gold watch chain. These details mattered. On the frontier, appearance was currency. It suggested stability, reliability, or at least the illusion of both. Now let's gently wander toward the piano again. The piano player was an essential figure. Not glamorous, not famous, but deeply necessary. Music's soft attention. It filled awkward silences. It masked the dull thud of disappointment when someone lost a hand of cards. The repertoire rarely expanded. Popular tunes of the era drifted westward slowly. A melody from New York City might take months to become recognizable in a small Montana town. By then, it was already out of fashion back east. But fashion moves slower when you're crossing deserts by wagon. Occasionaiji, a traveling performer, would arrive. A singer, a comic storyteller, maybe even a small theatrical troupe. These evenings were rare and quietly thrilling. The saloon would fill earlier than usual. The bartender would stock extra bottles. People would sit closer together, not because they were suddenly sociable, but because entertainment was precious. Isolation defined frontier life. Any break in routine felt significant. Let's pause for a moment and consider something softer. Loneliness. Frontier towns were overwhelmingly male, particularly during mining booms. Some towns had ratios of 9 men to every woman, which meant the saloon was not merely a drinking establishment. It was a place to feel less alone. Conversation mattered. Even repetitive conversation, even exaggerated stories told for the 10th time. Male arrivals were major events. When the stagecoach rolled in, people drifted toward it with quiet anticipation. Letters were read inside the saloon, under lamplight. News from family back east. A birth announcement, a marriage. Sometimes a reminder that life elsewhere continued normally, without dust storms or cattle drives. These letters could lift spirits, or quietly sink them. The bartender noticed both reactions. We should also mention rules, because despite the reputation of lawlessness, many frontier towns were surprisingly structured. Saloons often had posted regulations. No firearms inside, no fighting. Payment required before excessive intoxication. Of course, enforcement depended on the owner's confidence and the town marshal's mood. But most patrons respected the rules, not out of fear, out of practicality. A destroyed saloon helps no one. The town marshal himself might appear occasionally. He was rarely the mythic gunslinger. More often, he was a middle-aged man with administrative fatigue. He drank slowly, watched quietly, stepped in only when absolutely necessary. Paperwork, even in the 1870s, was exhausting. He preferred calm evenings. Every gun, let's gently shift toward closing time. The lamps burn lower. Conversations grow softer. Someone dozes with his head on folded arms. The piano stops mid-note because the pianist has decided that is sufficient for one day. Chairs scrape back. Coins clink onto the counter. A few promises are made about early starts tomorrow. None will be kept enthusiastically. Outside, the frontier night is cool and wide. Stars stretch endlessly overhead. The saloon door swings shut with a familiar creak. And inside, the bartender counts the till, not with excitement, not with despair, just with the steady acceptance that tomorrow will look remarkably similar. And that repetition is the real story of Frontier Saloon life. Not constant drama, not explosive violence, but routine. Human routine. Work. Drink. Talk. Sleep. Repeat. So let's linger here for a moment longer. The building settles. The lanterns dim. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote calls. Not dramatically, just because that's what coyotes do. The street outside a Frontier Saloon was rarely dramatic. It was dusty in summer, muddy in spring, frozen solid in winter. If you're imagining a perfectly staged movie set with tumbleweeds rolling on cue, I hate to disappoint you. Real tumbleweeds are deeply uncooperative. They show up when they want. Most frontier towns were built quickly. Very quickly, when gold was discovered in places like California during the gold rush, or silver was found in Nevada, entire towns sprang up in months, not years. Months. That kind of speed does not produce architectural elite. It produces uneven sidewalks and buildings that lean slightly to the left, like they're tired. The saloon usually sat prominently on Main Street, not because it was morally superior, but because it was financially dependable. People might skip church. They might delay paying a blacksmith. But they rarely skipped the saloon entirely. Human beings have always prioritized conversation and mild intoxication. Across the street, you'd likely find a general store. Possibly a barber. Maybe a boarding house for unmarried men. The boarding house deserves a quiet moment of appreciation. It was not glamorous. Narrow beds. Shared rooms. Thin walls. Imagine 6 tired cowboys sleeping in one space, boots lined up near the door. Privacy was theoretical. Boarding houses often fed their residents as well. Meals were heavy. Beans, salted meat, bread if supplies allowed. Fresh vegetables were rare unless the town had stabilized enough for farming nearby. Nutrition was inconsistent, which makes the saloon's whiskey look almost medicinal by comparison. Now, let's talk about the so-called dance halls. Hollywood tends to blur saloons and dance halls together. In reality, some towns had separate establishments where music and dancing were more structured. Women working there were often hired to dance with customers for a small fee. It was business, calculated, controlled, not the wild chaos of film. These women navigated social boundaries carefully. Respectability mattered, even in rough towns, especially in rough towns. The illusion of constant danger in frontier towns is fascinating. Yes, there were gunfights. Yes, conflicts happened. But statistically, many towns were quieter than their legends suggest. Take Tombstone, for example, immortalized for the shootout near the OK Corral. That event was dramatic, certainly, but it lasted less than a minute. Less than a minute, and it defined the town's reputation forever. Meanwhile, most days in Tombstone involved laundry, bookkeeping, and people arguing about property lines. Frontier life was repetitive, which is not very cinematic, but it is deeply human. The blacksmith hammered horseshoes. The schoolteacher, if the town had progressed that far, taught children basic arithmetic. The doctor worried about limited supplies. Everyone worried about fire. Wooden towns burn easily. One stray spark could undo years of work. Let's drift back toward the saloon porch. During the day, it looked different. Sunlight revealed imperfections. Scratches on the door. Dusts layered on windowsills. A man might sit in a chair outside, hat tipped low, conserving energy. Heat, in the American West, was relentless. Shade was currency. Stagecoaches rolled in, occasionally, connecting these isolated settlements to larger hubs like Denver. The arrival was practical, not theatrical. Mailbags unloaded. Passengers stretched stiff legs. Supplies were counted, and then the coach departed again, leaving behind a faint cloud of dust and a reminder that the outside world existed. For many residents, the frontier was not an adventure. It was an economic decision. Land was cheaper. Opportunity felt possible. Back east, in crowded cities like Boston, competition was intense. Out here, the risk was higher, but so was the potential reward. At least in theory, reality often included droughts, failed climbs, and profound homesickness. Let's not forget families. While early boomtowns skewed heavily male, many frontier settlements gradually became more balanced. Wives arrived, children were born. Schools formed, churches were built, and the saloon adjusted accordingly. In more established towns, stricter codes of conduct developed. Public drunkenness became less charming. Civilization, as they called it, crept in slowly. Of course, not everyone welcomed that shift. Some preferred the earlier, looser days. The time before property taxes and social expectations. Before someone suggested that perhaps one should not sing loudly at midnight. Progress has always been controversial. But here's the quiet truth. The saloon remained central through all of it. Whether the town was a rough mining camp or a growing agricultural hub, people gathered there. Business deals were made. Political discussions unfolded. Friendships formed. Rivalries simmered gently. It was not just about alcohol. It was about proximity. Humans clustered together against the vastness of the frontier. As evening falls again, lanterns flicker to life along the street. Shadows stretch long. The temperature drops just enough to feel merciful. Boots thud against wooden boardwalks. Someone laughs softly. Not a cinematic cackle, just relief at surviving another day. And we step back toward the swinging doors once more. Inside, the familiar glow waits. The piano warms up with a hesitant chord. The bartender wipes down the counter in slow, circular motions. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just routine. Frontier saloon life was built on routine, on repetition, on small comforts, stitched together in a landscape that felt endlessly uncertain. We're back inside the saloon one last time. The lamps are burning low again. The piano player has decided he knows exactly 3 songs, and that is more than enough for one lifetime. The bartender stands behind the counter, not rushed, not dramatic, just steady, because frontier life was rarely explosive. It was mostly endurance. Let's talk about something subtle tonight. Change. Because while the saloon feels timeless, it wasn't. Nothing on the frontier truly was. In the early years, when towns were new and optimism ran high, the saloon was loud, hopeful, slightly reckless. Gold had just been discovered. Silver veins promised wealth. Cattle drives brought seasonal money and seasonal chaos. People believed they were on the edge of something big, but slowly, quietly, things shifted. The railroad arrived in more places. Towns that were once isolated became connected, and connection changes behavior. When trains linked settlements to larger cities, supplies became cheaper. Mail arrived faster. News traveled quickly, and suddenly, the frontier felt less wild and more supervised. In territories that became formal states like Wyoming and New Mexico, governments grew more structured. Law enforcement stabilized. Courts became more predictable. Businesses required licenses, which, as you can imagine, thrilled absolutely no one who had grown comfortable with looser rules. The saloon adapted. Of course, it always did. Floors became cleaner. Glassware improved. Some establishments even added decorative touches: mirrors, polished brass fixtures, imported bottles from places like San Francisco. Respectability crept in quietly. The rowdiest nights became less frequent. The piano stayed more in tune. Families had settled in by now. Churches stood firmly at the end of Main Street. Schools operated regularly. Children walked past saloon doors without staring too long. The town's priorities were shifting from survival to stability. And stability, while wonderful, is not particularly cinematic. Then came the final, gentle twist. The temperance movement across the United States Particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, movements advocating for the reduction or elimination of alcohol gained strength. In some regions, saloons closed entirely. In others, they rebranded or operated more discreetly. Eventually, national prohibition would arrive in 1920. But even before that, the golden age of the Frontier Saloon was fading. Not with a bang, with paperwork. The men who once crowded the bar grew older. The miners moved on when veins dried up. The cowboys found ranch work that required more routine and less wandering. Some towns prospered and modernized. Others simply emptied out, buildings left behind. Wooden signs creaking in the wind. If you visit ghost towns in places like Arizona today, you'll still find the shells of saloons. Empty rooms, sunlight pouring through broken windows. The bar counter's still standing, as if waiting for someone to lean on it and complain about cattle prices one more time. And that's the quiet truth of Frontier Saloon life. It was not endless duels. Not constant danger. Not heroic standoffs every Tuesday afternoon. It was ordinary people navigating extraordinary geography. It was exhaustion softened by companionship. It was watered-down whiskey shared under lamplight. It was laughter that echoed briefly against wooden walls before drifting into the wide western night. The saloon worked because the frontier was isolating. Vast landscapes can make a person feel very small. A warm room, even a smoky one, makes them feel seen. So now, as we close this final evening, imagine the bartender placing the last glass upside down on the counter. The piano lid lowering gently. Chairs turned onto tables. The lanterns dimmed one by one. Outside, the town is quieter than it used to be. Fewer boots on the boardwalk. Fewer wagons passing through. The railroad whistle sounds in the distance. Steady and modern. The frontier did not vanish overnight. It just became less raw, less temporary, less desperate. And the saloon, that humble wooden heart of so many towns, either transformed or simply faded into memory. So we'll leave it here. No gunshots, no dramatic sunset silhouettes, just a wooden door swinging softly shut. The lamps go dark. The dust settles, and the story ends exactly the way most frontier evenings did. Quietly, now we begin with water? Yes. Not exactly the most dramatic hook in human history. No sword fights, no royal tantrums, just water, flowing gently downhill. So go ahead and dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe grab a blanket, because for the next while, we are going to drift through one of the most quietly obsessive engineering projects of the ancient world. And I promise, it will be calmer than it sounds. Imagine standing in ancient Rome. Not the tourist Rome, not the one with selfie sticks and espresso bars, but Rome around 300 BCE. It smells agricultural, slightly damp. There are animals, there are people. There is definitely no indoor plumbing in the modern sense. And the population is growing, which is wonderful. Except for one small detail. Everyone needs water. Now, before aqueducts, Romans relied on wells, springs, and the Tiber River. The Tiber was helpful. It was nearby. It was flowing. It was also not always clean. Cities have a way of turning rivers into multi-purpose utilities. Drinking source, laundry facility, occasional dumping ground. You can imagine how that worked out. As Rome expanded, the old system just couldn't keep up. More baths, more fountains, more people who absolutely insisted on washing occasionally. So, in 312 BCE, during the same year that roads were being aggressively constructed, a Roman official named Appius Claudius Caecus decided Rome needed something ambitious, something dramatic, something that said, yes, we are a civilization, thank you. Enter the Aqua Appia. Now, the Aqua Appia was not flashy. It ran mostly underground. No grand arches yet. No postcard-worthy silhouettes. Just a long, carefully sloped channel bringing fresh water into the city. It stretched about 16 kilometers, which is impressive when you remember this was done with manual labor, stone tools, and a level of stubbornness that defines Roman infrastructure And here's the thing about Roman engineers. They were slightly obsessed with precision. Aqueducts worked almost entirely on gravity. No pumps, no modern machinery, just a steady, gentle slope. Too steep, and the water would rush destructively. Too flat, and it would stagnate, so they calculated gradients that sometimes dropped only a few centimeters per 100 meters, which means someone was out there, in a toga, measuring that. Carefully, over time, Rome built more aqueducts, because once you start delivering fresh water into a city, people get used to it. They begin to expect it. They start building enormous bath complexes, like the baths of Caracalla. Because of course they do. If you have unlimited water, why not create a multi-room spa the size of a shopping mall? Let's pause for a moment and appreciate Roman baths. They were not just for hygiene. They were social centers, networking hubs, places where senators debated policy while half submerged in warm water. It's surprisingly efficient. Hard to argue aggressively when you're in a steam room, and all of that required water. A lot of Italiano. By the height of the Roman Empire, Rome had 11 aqueducts feeding the city. 11, some of them, like the Aqua Claudium, featured those iconic arches we associate with Roman engineering. Tall, repeating stoned arcades, stretching across valleys. Beautiful, functional, slightly intimidating. The arches weren't just aesthetic. They allowed aqueducts to maintain that perfect hintel slope Oberuneben terrain, instead of dipping down into a valley and climbing back up, which gravity refuses to do, tabletop, layer upon layer of stone, carefully aligned, creating that serene rhythm of repeating curves. It's oddly calming to look at. Now, here's something that doesn't get enough attention. Aqueduct maintenance. Because building one is impressive, keeping it clean is another story. Roman officials assigned workers to inspect channels, remove mineral buildup, and repair cracks. Water leaves deposits over time. Limestone accumulates. If neglected, the flow slows. And Rome did not enjoy slow water. There were even laws protecting aqueducts. Severe penalties for anyone who tampered with them, because in a city of over 1 million people, water supply is not optional. It is civilization itself. Let's float over to another region for a moment. Rome wasn't the only culture building aqueduct-like systems. The Greeks had earlier water channels. The Persians created Knas underground tunnels that transported water across dry landscapes. The Achaemenid Empire used them effectively in arid regions. Quiet, ingenious, and less showy than Roman arches, but incredibly efficient. Meanwhile, in places like Carthage, elaborate aqueduct systems supported urban life long before Rome conquered the region. In fact, after Rome defeated Carthage, they expanded its water infrastructure even further. Because if there's one thing Rome loved, it was improving conquered cities in very practical ways. Water, after all, is politically useful. An emperor could win public favor by funding a new aqueduct. It demonstrated power, stability, generosity. Look, they could imply, I bring you fresh water, which is far more persuasive than a speech. But aqueducts were not purely benevolent gifts. They reinforced hierarchy. Wealthy households often had private connections. Public fountains served everyone else. Baths were accessible, but still structured by class. Even water had social layers. And yet, when you stand beneath a surviving Roman aqueduct today, something feels steady about it. The arches are balanced. The stone is weathered but resilient. It whispers of long-term thinking, of planning beyond one lifetime. Of course, Rome eventually declined. Maintenance faltered. Aqueducts fell into disrepair. Some were damaged during invasions. Others simply crumbled over centuries, and medieval cities often shrank, relying again on wells and rivers. It's a quiet irony. A civilization capable of transporting millions of liters of water daily eventually forgot how to maintain it, or perhaps simply lacked the resources to continue. Still, many aqueducts survived, because Roman engineering was annoyingly durable. So tonight, as we let this gentle stream of history flow, imagine water moving slowly through stone channels, no pumps humming, no plastic pipes, Just gravity doing its patient work. Now, let's gently drift eastward, away from the loud confidence of Rome, away from the dramatic stone arcades stretching across valleys, and into something far more subtle, far more patient, almost invisible. We're heading into the lands once ruled by the Achaemenid Empire, because while Rome built upward, stacking stone into proud arches that said, "Look what we can do," the Persians often built downward, quietly, underground, where no one could admire it unless they were particularly enthusiastic about crawling into tunnels. These systems were called canals. Now imagine a dry landscape, harsh sun, sparse vegetation, not exactly the kind of place where you expect abundant water infrastructure. And yet, beneath that earth, a slow miracle is happening. A qanat begins high in the foothills, where groundwater collects naturally. Workers dig a gently sloping tunnel that stretches for kilometers underground. Along the way, vertical shafts are carved straight down from the surface. These shafts allow workers to remove soil during construction and provide ventilation. From above, it looks like a line of evenly spaced holes marching across the desert. From below, it's a narrow corridor where cool groundwater flows steadily toward settlements. No arches, no decorative stonework, just engineering that respects gravity and avoids evaporation by staying underground. Because, in a hot climate, keeping water shaded is not just clever, it's essential. And here's the sleepy beauty of it. Once built, a qanat requires no fuel, no machinery, no constant supervision. Who's this low, reliable pull of gravity? It's almost meditative. The Persian world understood that water was power. In cities like Persepolis, royal complexes relied on controlled water systems, not just for drinking, but for gardens. Persian gardens were carefully designed spaces where water symbolized order and paradise. Flowing channels divided greenery into geometric patterns, a reminder that even in dry lands, structure could tame chaos. And unlike the Romans, who loved their public baths and social splashing, Persian water use was often quieter, more focused on irrigation, agriculture, sustaining life in regions where rainfall could not be trusted. Let's just pause there for a second. The Romans were dramatic about water. Huge baths, monumental fountains, aqueducts towering like stone rainbows. The Persians, they hid it underground, protected it, whispered it into fields and orchards. Two civilizations, same need, very different personalities. And it wasn't just Persia. Further east, in parts of what is now India, ancient engineers developed not aqueducts in the Roman sense, but deeply thoughtful water systems designed to manage seasonal rains. Stepwells like Rani Kivav are architectural marvels, descending staircases carved deep into the earth, leading down to water that rises and falls with the seasons. During dry months, people walked further down the steps. During monsoon season, water filled the lower levels. They weren't just functional, they were beautiful, decorated with intricate carvings, pillars, sculptures, which is fascinating if you think about it. In Rome, water arrived dramatically from afar. In Persia, it traveled unseen beneath the ground. In India, people descended toward it, almost ceremonially. Different approaches, same quiet human anxiety. What if we run out? Let's float over to another region. The ancient Greeks also experimented with water systems. On the island of Samos, engineers in the 6th century BCE built the tunnel of a water tunnel dug from both ends simultaneously through a mountain. And somehow, remarkably, they met in the middle, which is either brilliant planning or the most confident gamble in engineering history. That tunnel carried water safely into the city, protecting the supply from potential attack. Because water is vulnerable, a city can survive a shortage of luxury goods. It cannot survive long without drinking water. Back in Rome, the aqueduct network continued to expand for centuries. Even provincial cities throughout the empire received their own water systems. In places like Enchiems, the famous Pont du Gard still stands, a multi-tiered aqueduct bridge that looks almost too elegant for its purpose. It's interesting how water infrastructure becomes art. No one builds a monument to sewer pipes today, but ancient aqueducts, they become icons. Yet, despite their grandeur, these systems were fragile in a political sense. When empires weakened, maintenance budgets shrank. Skilled labor dispersed. In Rome, after the Western Empire declined, several aqueducts fell into ruin. Medieval populations shrank dramatically. The massive flow of water was no longer required. There's something quietly poetic about that. Civilizations rise. They channel rivers. They build arches and tunnels. They regulate springs. And then, over time, the water continues. The people change. By the medieval period in Europe, many cities relied again on wells, on rivers, on simpler systems. The grand Roman network had faded. Knowledge wasn't entirely lost, but large-scale investment was rare. Meanwhile, qanats in Persia continued operating. Some still function today because when something works gently and consistently, it doesn't demand constant reinvention. It just flows. So, as we sit here tonight, thinking about aqueducts, it's easy to imagine only stone arches under sunset skies. But the ancient world was far more diverse. Water moved through mountains, under deserts, down carved staircases, across bridges, through carefully angled tunnels, dug by men squinting at the sun and calculating slopes with astonishing patience. And none of it was flashy in the moment. It was practical. It was necessary. It was deeply human. Now let's gently float across the Atlantic. Long before European ships arrived with questionable intentions and very confident maps, civilizations in the Americas were already solving the same quiet problem. How do you move water from where it is to where you need it? Let's begin high in the Andes. Picture steep slopes, thin air, terraced hillsides carved into mountains like giant staircases. This is the world of the Inca. And unlike Rome, which used water for enormous public bathing rituals, Inca water use often had ceremonial significance. Flowing fountains symbolized purity, authority, order, even power. Water, once again, was political. Let's drift north now, into the dense jungles of Mesoamerica. The Maya faced a different challenge entirely. Many Maya cities were built in regions without permanent rivers, which is inconvenient, to say the least. At places like Tikal, there were no large rivers flowing conveniently past the temples, so the Maya engineered reservoirs. They created large, lined basins to collect and store rainwater during the wet season. These reservoirs, sometimes called aguadas, were essential. Without them, cities would not survive dry months. And here's the quiet twist. Recent studies suggest the Maya even used natural filtration methods, layers of sand and certain minerals, to help purify stored water. Not because it was trendy, but because stagnant water becomes unpleasant very quickly. So while Roman citizens soaked in heated pools, the Maya were carefully managing rain cycles in tropical climates. Different geography, same anxiety. Let's float further north, into the American Southwest, into lands that are dry, wide, and deceptively unforgiving. The ancestral Pueblones, often associated with sites like Chaco Canyon, developed systems to capture and direct seasonal rainfall. Small dams, check dams, carefully angled channels carved into stone. Rain in this region does not fall gently and consistently. It arrives suddenly, sometimes violently, and then disappears. So water control was about timing, capturing brief abundance, holding it long enough to sustain crops. There's something quietly humbling about this. Meanwhile, in the Old World, aqueduct knowledge faded and returned in cycles. Medieval Europe relied on simpler wells and then, gradually, urban growth demanded more elaborate systems again. By the Renaissance, engineers looked back at Roman ruins with admiration. We should probably try that again, they seemed to think. And they did. But tonight, we're not rushing forward to modern plumbing. We're staying here, in this ancient rhythm. Imagine standing beside an Inca fountain, watching water spill gently from one carved stone lip to another. Or picture a Roman aqueduct stretching across golden countryside. Or a Persian qanat, cool and dark beneath your feet, carrying life silently through desert soil, all of them built without electricity, all of them powered by slope and patience. No dramatic explosions, no roaring machines, just gravity and human stubbornness. It's strangely comforting, because it reminds us that even thousands of years ago, people worried about practical things: clean water, storage, distribution, maintenance budgets. In ancient terms, Rome had once supported 11 aqueducts feeding the city. By the early medieval period, only a few functioned properly. Population declined, urban centers shrank. The demand for massive water flow wasn't the same, and maintaining a 50-kilometer stone water channel requires organization, funding, skilled labor, none of which are particularly abundant during centuries of political fragmentation. So many medieval towns returned to simpler methods. Wells, cisterns, local springs. Not glamorous, not monumental, but practical. In Islamic regions, however, ancient water traditions continued more robustly. Cities like Cordoba, under Islamic rule, maintained sophisticated water networks, public baths, and irrigation systems. The Qanat tradition remained alive across Persia and parts of North Africa. So, while parts of Europe simplified their water systems, other regions preserved and refined theirs. It's a gentle reminder that history rarely moves in one straight line. Now let's float into the Renaissance. By the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, European cities were growing again. Commerce expanded. Populations increased, and suddenly, wells felt insufficient. Engineers began studying Roman ruins more seriously. Ancient texts, people stood beneath surviving aqueduct arches and thought, they managed this 2,000 years ago. Surely we can manage something similar. In Rome, several aqueducts were restored during the Renaissance. Popes funded projects to bring fresh water back into the city. The Aqua Virgin, originally built in 19 BCE, was repaired and put back into service. By the 19th century, modern municipal water systems emerged in cities like London. Large-scale reservoirs, underground sewer networks, filtration plants. Water was no longer guided only by gravity. It was pushed, pressurized, engineered with industrial precision. But beneath all that innovation, the same ancient principle remained. Water must move. It must be protected. It must be managed. And whether it traveled through a Roman arch, a Persian tunnel, an Inca fountain, or a Victorian pipe, the intention was the same. Keep people alive. Keep cities functioning. Keep civilization steady. There's something oddly soothing about that continuity. Empires rise. Titles change. Languages shift. Borders redraw themselves endlessly. But someone, somewhere, is still calculating slope and flow rate. Still checking for leaks. Still worrying about supply during dry months. And if you stand beneath a surviving aqueduct today, whether it's the Pont du Gard in France or a weathered stone channel in Peru, you can almost feel the patience embedded in it. Stone placed upon stone. Measured, adjusted, trusted to last. So let the arches fade into twilight. Let the tunnels cool into darkness. Let the fountains whisper softly in stone courtyards. And we'll end here. Calm, balanced, unhurried, just like gravity.
Today we will talk about a very old history topic. This story is from a time when there were no house, no cities, no schools and no books. This is the story of fire. Fire is not just a thing but that burns. Fire changed everything. Fire made human different from animals. Without fire there would be no food like today, no protection, no progress, and maybe no modern world. This is the story of how fire slowly changed human life step by step. Long, long ago, humans were very weak. They had no clothes, no proper homes, and no weapons. They lived in forest and open land. They were always afraid. Big animals hunted them, cold weather, hot there, dark nights scared them. Human ate raw food. Raw meat was hard to chew. Raw plants were bitter and dangerous. People got sick easily. Many people died young. Life was very hard. The first time humans saw fire. Yes, fire was not first made by human. Fire came from nature. Lighting heat trees, volcanoes burned land, dry forest caught fire. Early humans saw fire from far away. They saw bright light. They felt heat. At first, they were scared. Fire was dangerous. Fire burned skin. Fire destroyed trees. But humans are curious. They watched fire carefully. Slowly, humans understood something important. Fire is dangerous, but fire is also useful. Fire give heat, fire give light. People start keeping fire interested of running away. They carried burning wood from natural fire. They portrayed that fire carefully. If fire dead, life became hard again. Fire became like a friend. Fire and warmth. Cold weather was deadly before fire. Winter killed many people. People slept at night. Fire changed this. Fire kept human warm and people could live in a colder place. They could travel to new lands. Fire helped humans survive winter. This was a very big change in history. Fire and light. Before fire, night was very dark. Darkness brought fear. Wild animal hunted at night. Fire brought light. People could see at night. They could stay together. They could talk and think. This helped humans before social. This helped humans share idea. Fire created community. Fire and protection. Fire scared wild animal. Animal were afraid of flame. They stayed away from fire. Humans used fire as protection. They slept near fire. This saved many lives. Fire became a side. Fire and cooked food. This was one of the biggest change in human history. Yes, human learned to cook food. Cooked meat was soft. Cooked plant were safe. People became stronger. Their brains grew bigger. Good food gave more energy. Scientists believe cooking helped human become intelligent. Fire helped create the human brain. Fire and tools. Fire helped humans make tools. They hardened wood in fire. They shaped stone using heat. Later, fire helped me melt metal. This lead to copper tools. They bronze tools. They iron tools. Fire started technology. Fire and caves. Human lived in caves. Caves were dark and cold. Fire made caves livable. Fire kept animal away. Fire gave light inside cave. Human painted on cave walls using firelight. This was early art. This was early culture. Fire and social life. Fire brought people together. People sat around fire, they talked, they shared stories. This was the beginning of language, this was the beginning of tradition. Fire created human society, learned to make fire. At first, human protected natural fire. Later, they learned to make fire. They rubbed stones, they rubbed wood. This was a huge discovery. Now fire was always available. Human we are no longer dependent on nature. This was the freedom. Fire and migration. Fire allowed humans to move. They went to good lands. They crossed mountains. Fire helped humans spread across the world, from Africa to Asia, from Asia to Europe, from Europe to everywhere. Fire helped humans conquering that plant. Fire and religion. Fire became scared. People believe fire was a magic. People worshipped fire. Yes, many religions used fire. Fire rituals started. Fire became a symbol of life. Fire and farming. Fire helped clear forest. People burned land. This made farming possible. Yes, farming changed human life. People settled down. Villages formed and cities we are born. Are you know? Fast start civilization. Fire and industry. Thousands of years later, fire powered machine, fire boiled water, steam and gas were born. Factors started, trains moved, fire became energy. Fire and modern world. Today, fire still help us. Electric comes from fire. Cooking users use fire. Industries uses fire, and fire still saves human life. Conclusion: fire is not just that the fire is the history. Fire made humans human. Without fire, there would be no civilization, no cities, no technology. Fast is the greatest discovery in a human history. This, thank you. Today, now this is a very interesting story. I am feeling mm, very relaxed now, because I am try to very best now to please subscribe, like, and comment. Thank you.